$3. That was the price of a human soul in Dry Creek, Arizona in 1885. Not gold, not land. 3 crumpled dollar bills thrown into the dust. Elodie May stood on the auction block, trembling as the men laughed her own stepfather selling her to cover a gambling debt. But when the saloon doors swung open, the laughter died. A man walked in a shadow with a gun on his hip and a face carved from granite. He bought her for the price of a drink. Everyone thought he was a monster. But when they got alone and the terrifying cowboy finally dropped to his knees before her, Elodie didn't sigh in relief. She screamed. What he revealed in that moment would change history and uncover a secret that would burn the Wild West to the ground. The air inside the broken spur tasted of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and despair. It was a thick, choking atmosphere that clung to the back of Elodie May's throat, making it impossible to swallow the lump of terror that had lodged there. She was 19 years old, with hair the color of spun honey that had been matted by dust and neglect, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. Tonight, those eyes were wide, darting frantically across the sea of leering faces illuminated by the flickering oil lamps. "Look at her strong teeth-wide hips!" Tobias Gentry bellowed, swaying unsteadily on a crate he had dragged into the center of the saloon. He gripped Elodie's arm hard enough to bruise, shaking her like a rag doll. "She cooks, she cleans, and she don't talk much unless you tell her to. A perfect wife for any man willing to clear my tab." Elodie whimpered, trying to pull away. But Tobias backhanded her. It wasn't a hard blow, just enough to sting, just enough to remind her of the last 3 years of hell since her mother died of fever. Tobias wasn't her blood. He was the mistake her mother had made in a moment of loneliness. And now he was selling that mistake to the highest bidder. "I'll give you $5 if she comes with the horse," a toothless miner shouted from the back, sending a ripple of cruel laughter through the room. "5. "She ain't worth the hay the horse eats," another man jeered. $2. "And that's charity, Tobias." Elodie felt tears prick her eyes, hot and humiliating. She wasn't a person here. She was livestock. She looked towards the door, praying for a sheriff, a preacher, anyone with a shred of decency. But this was Dry Creek. Decency had dried up along with the river 5 years ago. "Come on, boys," Tobias shouted, sweat dripping down his greasy forehead. He was desperate. He owed money to the wrong people, specifically to the cruel saloon owner, Cyrus Vane. "She's a virgin, pure as the driven snow. Surely that's worth a 10 spot." The mention of her purity changed the energy in the room. It shifted from mocking to predatory. Men who had been leaning back in their chairs suddenly sat up, eyes narrowed. The laughter died down, replaced by a heavy, dangerous silence. Cyrus Vane, a man who wore a suit too fine for the dirt floor, stepped out from behind the bar. He wiped a glass with a dirty rag, his eyes locking on to Elodie. "I'll take her, Tobias," Vane said, his voice like grinding gravel, "for the debt you owe. $200. The room gasped. 200 was a fortune. Tobias's eyes lit up with greed. Elodie felt her knees buckle. Vane was a monster. It was rumored he kept women in the cellar, women who were never seen again. If Vane bought her, death would be a mercy. "Done," Tobias shrieked. "Sold to Mr. Vane." "Not yet." A voice cut through the smoke. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The saloon doors had swung open without a sound. Standing there, framed by the moonlight outside, was a man who looked like he had walked straight out of a nightmare. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He wore a long black duster coat, coated in the red dust of the territory. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but the glint of silver on his belt was unmistakable. 2 revolvers, low slung, tied down, a gunfighter. The room went deathly silent. Even Cyrus Vane stopped polishing his glass. The stranger stepped into the light. He had a scar running from his left temple down to his jaw, cutting through a dark stubble. His eyes were not stormy like Elodie's. They were cold, hard flint. "Who invited you, stranger?" Vane asked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Nobody," the stranger said. He walked forward, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. He didn't look at Vane. He didn't look at Tobias. He looked straight at Elodie. She flinched under his gaze. It wasn't lust. It wasn't pity. It was an intense, analyzing stare, as if he were reading a map written on her skin. "The girl is sold," Vane snapped. "The girl is sold when money changes hands," the stranger said. He stopped in front of the crate. He towered over Tobias, who suddenly looked very small. The stranger reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a bag of gold. He didn't pull out a stack of bills. He pulled out 3 silver dollars. Clink, clink, clink. He dropped them onto the wooden crate at Elodie's feet. $3, the stranger said. Tobias blinked, confused. "Are you deaf?" Mr. Vane offered 200. Vane offered paper, the stranger said, his hand drifting casually to rest on the pearl handle of his Colt revolver. "I'm offering silver, and I'm offering you the chance to walk out of here with your kneecaps intact." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. This wasn't a barter. It was a robbery in plain sight. "Now listen here," Tobias started. In a blur of motion, too fast to track, the stranger drew. He didn't shoot Tobias. He fired a single bullet into the floor, less than an inch from Tobias's boot. The deafening boom shook the room. Splinters flew. Tobias shrieked and fell backward off the crate. $3, the stranger repeated, his voice unchanged. "Take it and run, or stay and bleed." Tobias scrambled in the dirt, grabbing the 3 coins with shaking hands. He didn't look at Elodie. He didn't look back. He scrambled on all fours toward the back door and vanished into the night, leaving his stepdaughter behind for the price of a cheap meal. The stranger holstered his gun. He looked at Cyrus Vane. "Any objections?" Vane's face was purple with rage, but he looked at the smoking gun, then at the stranger's cold eyes. He recognized death when he saw it. Vane spat on the floor. "Take the trash and get out. Get out, but don't come back to my town, Colton Rance." Colton Rance. A collective gasp went through the room. Elodie stopped breathing. She had heard stories of Colton Rance. They called him the ghost of the Gila, a bounty hunter, a killer, a man who had burned down a bandit camp with the men still inside. Colton Rance didn't acknowledge the name. He reached up, grabbed Elodie by the wrist, and pulled her off the crate. His grip was iron, but surprisingly, it wasn't painful. "Let's go," he grunted. "Where?" Elodie whispered, her voice trembling. "Away from here." He dragged her through the silent saloon, past the staring eyes of the men who had just watched a human being sold for pocket change. Elodie stumbled after him out into the cool night air. She didn't know if she had just been saved, or if she had just been claimed by the devil himself. The night air was biting a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the saloon. Colton didn't stop at the hitching post. He marched Elodie toward a massive black stallion that snorted and stamped as they approached. "Mount up," he ordered. I can't ride," Elodie stammered. It was true. Tobias had never allowed her near the horses. He said animals were worth more than she was. Colton didn't sigh. He didn't scold. He simply grabbed her by the waist. For a second, her hands rested on his shoulders. The leather of his duster was cold, but the body beneath it was radiating heat. He hoisted her effortlessly onto the saddle, then swung himself up behind her. Elodie stiffened. His chest was pressed against her back. His arms caged her in as he took the reins. She could smell tobacco gunpowder and soap, a surprisingly clean scent for a man who looked like he lived in the dirt. "Hold on," he said, his voice vibrating through her spine. He kicked the horse into a gallop. They tore out of Dry Creek, leaving the lights of the saloon behind. They rode into the vast, empty darkness of the desert. For hours they didn't speak. The only sounds were the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the wind rushing past their ears. Elodie's mind raced. Why did he buy me? What does he want? Is he going to take me to the middle of nowhere and kill me? Or worse. She thought about jumping, but at this speed, she'd break her neck. She was trapped. The moon was high when they finally slowed. The terrain had changed from flat desert to rocky foothills. They were climbing. The air grew thinner, colder. Almost there, Colton muttered. It was the first thing he had said in 3 hours. They crested a ridge, and below them sat a small, isolated cabin nestled in a valley of pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming, which made Elodie even more terrified. Monsters often lived in castles. This man lived in a fortress of solitude. Colton guided the horse to the barn. He slid off first, then reached up to help her down. Her legs were numb from the ride, and she collapsed as soon as her boots hit the dirt. Colton caught her. Again that iron grip. He set her upright. "Inside," he said, pointing to the cabin. "There's stew on the stove. Eat." He turned to tend to his horse. He wasn't guarding her. He wasn't tying her up. Elodie walked to the cabin, her legs shaking. She pushed the heavy wooden door open. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth. It was simple a table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner covered in furs, and a pot of stew bubbling on the fire. Her stomach roared. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She found a bowl and spoon, and ate voraciously, burning her tongue, but not caring. 10 minutes later the door opened. Colton walked in. He took off his hat and hung it on a peg. Without the shadow of the brim, his face was even more severe. The scar was jagged and white against his tanned skin. He looked tired. He walked to the fire, warming his hands. He didn't look at her. "Why?" Elodie asked. Her voice was stronger now that she had food in her belly. "Why did you buy me? And why $3? Colton turned slowly. "Because $3 was all Tobias deserved, and because I needed something." "A wife?" Elodie asked, wrapping her arms around herself. "A servant?" Colton laughed, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "I don't need a wife, and I cook my own meals." "Then what?" He stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that made Elodie's blood run cold. He began to unbuckle his gun belt. He laid the heavy revolvers on the table. Then he took off his duster. "Stand up," he commanded. Elodie stood, backing away, until she hit the wall. "Please," she whispered. I've never—" "Stand up," he repeated, stepping closer. He was 3 feet away, 2 feet. He loomed over her. Then he stopped. His eyes dropped to her feet, then to her hands, then to her neck. "Show me your arm," he said softly. "What? Your left arm? Show it to me." Elodie hesitated. She wore a tattered, long-sleeved dress. Underneath the sleeve near her elbow was a birthmark, a strange reddish mark shaped almost like a crescent moon. She had always hated it. Tobias had called it the Devil's Mark. "Why? Do it!" Colton barked, his patience snapping. Trembling, Elodie rolled up her sleeve. The firelight danced on her pale skin, illuminating the crescent mark. Colton stared at it. His breath hitched. The hard, killer look in his eyes shattered. He looked devastated. Suddenly, the terrifying gunfighter, the ghost of the Gila, dropped. He fell to his knees in front of her. The hard wood floor cracked under the impact. Elodie panicked. A man kneeling meant a proposal or a prayer. But the look on his face wasn't love. It was agony. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the mark on her arm. "It's you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "God help me. It's really you." He reached for his boot. Elodie saw the glint of a knife handle. She didn't think. She reacted. Pure instinct took over. He was going to cut the mark off. He was going to kill her. "No!" Elodie screamed, a high, piercing sound that echoed off the cabin walls. She kicked out her boot, connecting with his shoulder, sending him sprawling backward. She grabbed the boiling pot of water from the stove, not the stew, but the water heating for coffee, and heaved it toward him. "Stay back!" she shrieked, backing toward the door. Colton scrambled up, ignoring the scalding water that splashed his boots. "Elodie, wait! You don't understand." "I understand enough!" she yelled. She grabbed one of the heavy revolvers from the table. It was too heavy for her. She had to use 2 hands to lift it. She pointed the shaking barrel at his chest. "You bought me. You dragged me here, and now you have a knife." "Look at the knife, Elodie," Colton shouted, holding his hands up. "Look at the handle." Elodie's eyes flicked to the knife lying on the floor where he had dropped it. It wasn't a skinning knife. It was a dagger. And the handle was made of ivory. Inlaid into the white bone was a symbol. A red crescent moon, exactly like the ones on her arm. Elodie's breath caught in her throat. The gun wavered. "What is that? Why do you have that?" Colton remained on his knees, hands raised in surrender. "I didn't buy you to make you my wife, Elodie. And I didn't buy you to hurt you." He looked her dead in the eye, and the truth in his voice hit her harder than a bullet. "I bought you because 20 years ago I promised your real father I wouldn't let you die." The room spun. My real father, Tobias, said my father was a drifter." "Tobias lied," Colton said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Your father wasn't a drifter. He was the governor of the Arizona Territory, and he didn't die of fever." Colton lowered his hands slowly. "He was murdered by the same man who just sold you for $3. Elodie lowered the gun. Her world was tilting on its axis. "Tobias killed my father." "Yes," Colton said. "And now that I've found you, he's going to come for us. Because as long as you're alive, Elodie, you own half this state." Colton stood up, the shadow returning to his face. "Pack your things, girl. The $3 wasn't a purchase. It was a declaration of war, and the army is coming." The silence following Colton's revelation was heavier than the iron stove in the corner. Elodie stared at the ivory-handled dagger on the floor, the red crescent moon on the hilt mocking her ignorance. "My father," she whispered the words, tasting like ash. "Governor William Joyce, the man they say died of a heart attack in the Capitol." "He didn't have a heart attack," Colton said, moving with sudden, frantic urgency. He shoved the dagger into his boot and grabbed a canvas bag from under the bed. "He was poisoned, arsenic in his wine, and the man who poured it was Tobias Gentry, his trusted valet." Colton threw a box of ammunition to Elodie. She caught it against her chest, her hands trembling. "Tobias fled the Capitol with your mother the night of the murder," Colton explained, stripping the blankets off the bed to reveal a hidden compartment in the mattress frame. He pulled out a Winchester repeating rifle. "He convinced her that I was the killer, that he was saving her. He dragged her to the ends of the earth, used up her jewelry, and when the money ran out, he let her die of fever in that shack. He told me you were a monster," Elodie stammered. "He said the ghost of the Guyler ate children. Men like Tobias always paint the heroes as villains, so their own sins don't look so black," Colton growled. He kicked the fire out, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Stay low. Get to the back window." "Why, you said the army is coming. Are we leaving?" "We're not leaving yet," Colton said, cocking the rifle. "Because they're already here." As if on cue, the glass of the front window shattered inward. A lantern landed on the floorboards, exploding in a ball of kerosene-fueled fire. "Burn them out," a voice roared from outside. It wasn't Tobias. It was Cyrus Vane. The cabin filled with cornstorm instantly. Elodie screamed, dropping to her knees as bullets began to shred the wooden walls. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The wood splintered around her, sending sharp shards into her hair. "Get to the root cellar," Colton commanded. He didn't dive for cover. He stood his ground in the center of the room, the flames illuminating his scar, making him look truly demonic. He raised the Winchester and fired through the broken window. Bang, 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 3 shots, 3 screams of pain from outside. Elodie scrambled across the floor, her dress tearing on the rough wood. She found the trapdoor to the cellar under the rug, heaved it open, and slid into the cool, damp darkness below. Above her, the war raged. She could hear Colton's heavy boots stomping as he moved from window to window, firing with a terrifying rhythm. He wasn't just shooting, he was suppressing an army. But the heat was rising. The fire was spreading. Suddenly, the trapdoor was ripped open. Elodie shrieked, raising the heavy revolver she still clutched. It was Colton. His duster was smoking, and there was a streak of blood on his cheek. "Move!" he barked. "Tunnel leads to the creek. Go!" He dropped into the cellar, slamming the door shut above them, just as the roof of the cabin groaned and collapsed inward. They were plunged into total darkness. Elodie felt Colton's hand grab hers. His palm was rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. "Don't let go," he whispered in the dark. "Run." They ran through the narrow earthen tunnel, the smell of damp earth filling Elodie's nose. She could hear the muffled shouts of Vane's men above ground, stomping on the burning ruins looking for bodies. They emerged minutes later into the freezing water of the creek, hidden by the high reeds of the bank. The cold water shocked Elodie, soaking her dress instantly. Her teeth began to chatter. Colton didn't hesitate. He pulled her up the bank, toward where he had tethered the black stallion deep in the brush, anticipating the ambush. "You knew," Elodie said, her teeth clicking together. "You knew they would come." "Vane didn't buy you for lust, Elodie," Colton said, lifting her onto the horse. He swung up behind her, his chest pressing against her wet back, sharing his body heat. "He bought you because he found your mother's locket in Tobias's pawn pile. He figured out who you were. If he marries you, he controls the Joyce estate. He controls the water rights for the whole territory." He kicked the horse into a gallop away from the burning cabin, away from the only life Elodie had ever known. "He doesn't want a wife," Colton yelled over the wind. "He wants a puppet, and once he has the land, he'll cut your strings." They rode until the moon set, and the sun began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon. The landscape changed from pine forests to desolate, rocky canyons. Elodie was exhausted. Every muscle ached. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow fear. She was clinging to a man she had met 6 hours ago, a man who killed with the ease of breathing. "We stop here," Colton said, slowing the horse. They were entering a town, but it wasn't like Dry Creek. The buildings were grey, weathered skeletons. Doors hung off hinges. The sign above the livery stable swung in the wind with a mournful creak. "Silver Hollow," Elodie whispered. "It's a ghost town. They say it's cursed." "It's not cursed," Colton said, dismounting. "Just forgotten. Like us." He helped her down. Her legs gave out and she collapsed against his chest. For a moment, he held her there. It wasn't the grip of a captor. His hand rested gently on the back of her head, smoothing her tangled hair. "You did good, Elodie," he murmured. His voice was rough, unaccustomed to softness. "Most men would have frozen in that cabin. You moved." She looked up at him. The morning light caught his eyes. They weren't just cold flint anymore. There was exhaustion there, and something else, guilt. "Come on," he said, pulling away. "There's a church that still has a roof." Inside the abandoned church, Colton started a small fire in the sacristy using broken pews for wood. He produced a tin of beans and a canteen of water. Elodie sat near the fire, trying to dry her dress. She watched him clean his weapons. He treated the metal with more tenderness than he treated himself. "Why did you make a promise to my father?" she asked, breaking the silence. Colton paused, a rag in his hand. He looked at the stained glass window, shattered and letting in shafts of dusty light. I wasn't always a bounty hunter, he said quietly. 20 years ago, I was a Texas Ranger. Your father was the only politician who didn't treat us like dogs. He fought for funding for equipment. He was a good man in a land that hates good men. He holstered the gun and looked at her. The night he died, I was supposed to be on guard duty. But I was young. I was arrogant. I was at a saloon chasing a skirt. Elodie's eyes widened. When I got back to the governor's mansion, he was already dead. Tobias was gone, and you and your mother were missing. I failed him. Colton's voice cracked. I spent 20 years tracking Tobias. Every lead went cold, until last week. I heard rumors of a man in Dry Creek trying to sell a girl with a crescent birthmark. He stood up and walked over to her. He knelt again, but this time he didn't pull a knife. He reached out and took her hand. His thumb traced the dirt on her knuckles. I didn't buy you for $3 to own you, Elodie. I bought my redemption. Elodie looked at their joined hands, the gunfighter and the orphan. And now, she asked softly, what happens now? Now? Colton said, his gaze intense. We stop running. To claim your inheritance, we need proof. The birthmark isn't enough for a judge. We need the original deed to the Joyce land. I don't have it, Elodie said. Mother didn't have any papers? No, Colton agreed. But I know where your father hid it. He told me once jokingly where he kept his most precious secrets. He said, if I ever go missing, Colton, check the Devil's Pulpit. The Devil's Pulpit? Elodie frowned. That's a rock formation in the Badlands. It's Apache territory. Exactly, Colton said. No white man goes there and lives. That's why it's the perfect safe. He squeezed her hand. We ride at sundown. But first, you need to sleep. I'll keep watch. I won't fail you like I failed him. Elodie laid down on the old pew cushion. She watched Colton move to the door, his silhouette framed against the light. For the first time in 3 years, she closed her eyes and didn't feel afraid. She felt safe. The journey to the Devil's Pulpit took 2 grueling days. They moved through terrain that looked like the surface of Mars' red rocks, towering spires and heat that made the horizon shimmer. They had to be careful. This was the land of the Apache, and while Colton knew their customs, they were trespassers. As they rode, the dynamic between them shifted. Colton taught her how to shoot the Winchester. He showed her how to find water in a cactus. He stopped treating her like a package and started treating her like a partner. And Elodie found herself watching him. She watched the way his muscles bunched when he chopped wood, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he looked at the sunset. He was a hard man, a violent man, but he was the only truth she had ever known. On the 3rd afternoon, they reached the Devil's Pulpit. It was a massive, solitary pillar of rock rising 500 feet into the air. At its base was a small cave hidden by brush. Stay close, Colton warned, drawing his revolver. They entered the cave. It was cool and smelled of bats. In the back, under a pile of loose stones, Colton dug with his bare hands. He pulled out a metal strongbox. This is it, he breathed. He used his knife to pry the rusted lock open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of papers, the deed to the Joyce estate, and a letter sealed with wax. We have it, Elodie whispered, tears springing to her eyes. We can go to the marshal. We can put Tobias and Vane in jail. We can, Colton said, standing up. He handed her the box. You carry this. If anything happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you, Elodie interrupted fiercely. Colton looked at her, surprised by her tone. A rare, genuine smile touched his lips. He reached out, cupping her cheek. The skin of his palm was rough against her face. You're your father's daughter, he said softly. Brave, stubborn. He leaned in. The air between them crackled with electricity. Elodie's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to know what it felt like to be held by a man who would burn the world down for her. His lips brushed hers, a feather-light touch, hesitant testing. Elodie sighed, leaning into him, her hands clutching the lapels of his duster. Click. The sound of a hammer cocking echoed through the cave. Colton froze. He shoved Elodie behind him instantly, his own gun clearing leather in a blur. But it was too late. Standing at the mouth of the cave were 6 men. But they weren't Vane's men. They wore dusty blue uniforms. "Drop it, Rance," the leader said. He was a man with a thick moustache and a star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Redford, a man Colton had told Elodie was an old ally. "Redford." Colton narrowed his eyes. "What is this I'm bringing in the Joyce air? We need an escort to the capital." Redford spat on the ground. He didn't look like an ally today. He looked like a businessman. "Capital is a long way away, Colton," Redford said. "And the road is dangerous. Cyrus Vane, he offered a reward for the girl. A reward that pays better than a sheriff's salary. You sold us out." Colton's voice was low, dangerous. "For money. $10,000, Colton. That's retirement money." Redford gestured with his rifle. "Hand her over. You can ride away. I don't want to kill an old friend." "You know I can't do that," Colton said. "I was counting on it." Redford nodded to the men behind him. Colton moved. He pushed Elodie down behind a rock and opened fire. The cave exploded with noise. Bang Bang Colton took down 2 men instantly, but there were too many. A bullet caught Colton in the left shoulder, spinning him around. Another grazed his thigh. "Colton!" Elodie screamed. He fell to one knee, blood blooming on his duster. He fired again, killing a 3rd deputy, but his gun clicked empty. Redford walked forward and kicked the gun out of Colton's hand. He slammed the butt of his rifle into Colton's face. Colton collapsed unconscious. "No!" Elodie lunged forward, swinging the metal strongbox like a weapon. She struck Redford in the shin, but he just laughed and backhanded her, sending her sprawling into the dirt. He grabbed the strongbox. "Well, well, the deed. Vane will pay extra for this." He grabbed Elodie by her hair, hauling her to her feet. "Tie the girl up," Redford ordered the surviving deputies. "We ride for Dry Creek. Vane is waiting for his bride." "What about Rance?" a deputy asked, looking at Colton's motionless body. Redford looked down at the man who had been his friend. He pulled his revolver. "Leave him," Redford said. "He's bleeding out. The coyotes will finish him before sunset. Let the ghost of the Gila die in the dark." Elodie screamed Colton's name as they dragged her out of the cave, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. She watched as the darkness of the cave swallowed Colton's body. He didn't move. They threw her over a horse and rode away, leaving her protector, her love, to die alone in the dirt. But as the sound of hooves faded deep in the cave, a hand twitched. Colton Rance opened his eyes. They were hazy with pain, but the flint was back. He dragged himself toward his gun. He wasn't dead yet. And for Elodie, he would crawl out of hell itself. The town of Dry Creek had never looked more festive nor felt more like a graveyard. Cyrus Vane had spared no expense. He had ordered the saloon scrubbed of its grime-draped red ribbons over the bar, and hired a drunken preacher from 3 towns over. It was to be the wedding of the century, the union of the wealthiest man in the territory to the lost daughter of Governor Joyce. Upstairs in the room that had once been her prison, before the auction, Elodie sat in front of a cracked mirror. She wore a dress of white silk imported from San Francisco. It was beautiful, expensive, and it felt like a shroud. Her hair had been washed and pinned up, exposing her neck where the pulse jumped frantically under her skin. The door opened. Tobias Gentry slid into the room. He wore a new suit bought with the advance Vane had given him. "You look pretty, Elodie," he said, his voice oily. "Your mother would be proud." Elodie spun around, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare speak of her! You killed her! You killed my father." Tobias smirked, adjusting his cuffs. "I survived, girl. That's what matters in this world. And you will too if you say I do. Vane is a hard man, but he's rich. You'll have a roof over your head." "For how long?" Elodie challenged. "Until I sign the water rights over to him. Then I'll have a fever, just like Mother, won't I?" Tobias's smile faltered. He knew she was right. "Just make it easy on yourself. Don't cause a scene. Or what you'll sell me for $2 this time." Tobias raised a hand to strike her, but the door swung open again. It was Sheriff Redford. He looked nervous, sweating despite the cool evening air. "Time," Redford grunted. "Vane's waiting." They marched her downstairs. The saloon was packed. Every miner, drifter, and thief in Dry Creek was there, lured by the promise of free whiskey. They cheered as Elodie appeared at the top of the stairs, but the cheer died in their throats when they saw her face. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like a woman walking to the gallows. Cyrus Vane stood at the altar, a makeshift podium set up in front of the bar. He wore a black frock coat, the stolen deed tucked visibly into his breast pocket. He looked triumphant. "Music," Vane barked. A piano player started a discordant wedding march. Tobias gripped Elodie's arm, forcing her down the stairs, step by dragging step. "Colton is dead," she told herself, fighting back the tears. "He died alone in the dark because of me." She reached the altar. Vane took her hand. His grip was clammy. "Dearly beloved," the drunken preacher slurred, opening his Bible. "We are gathered here." Elodie looked at the doors. She prayed for them to burst open. She prayed for the man in the black duster, but the doors remained shut. "To join this man and this woman." Vane squeezed her hand, a silent warning to smile. "If anyone has any reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." Silence filled the room. The preacher nodded, satisfied. "Then by the power vested in me." Boom. It wasn't the doors opening. It was the sound of the glass skylight above the saloon, shattering into 1,000,000 diamonds. A rope dropped from the ceiling. A figure swung down, crashing onto the bar top in a shower of glass and whiskey bottles. The music stopped. The crowd screamed and scrambled back. Colton Rance stood on the bar. He looked like death warmed over. His duster was shredded. His shoulder was wrapped in a bloody bandage that looked distinctly like Apache tribal weaving. His face was pale, sweat-slicked, and his eyes were burning with a feverish, terrifying intensity. He held a dynamite stick in his left hand and his Colt revolver in his right. "I object," Colton rasped. Vane stared, his face draining of color. You're dead. Redford said you were dead." "Redford is a liar," Colton growled. He lit the fuse of the dynamite with a match struck against his boot. "And you, Vane, are standing too close to my woman." "Kill him!" Vane shrieked, diving behind the altar. Sheriff Redford and his deputies drew their guns. Colton didn't shoot. He threw the dynamite. It sailed over the heads of the crowd and landed in the fireplace. "Down!" Colton roared, jumping from the bar and tackling Elodie to the floor, covering her body with his own. The explosion blew the chimney out. The wall of the saloon disintegrated. Smoke, debris, and bricks flew everywhere. The concussion knocked the wind out of everyone in the room. Chaos erupted. Men were coughing, scrambling through the hole in the wall. The saloon was filling with thick, choking dust. Elodie coughed, her ears ringing. She felt Colton's weight lift off her. He pulled her up. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, scanning her face. "No," she choked out. She touched the bloody bandage on his shoulder. "You came back." "I told you," he gritted out, reloading his gun with shaking hands. "I had to redeem a pledge." "There he is," Redford shouted through the smoke. "Shoot him!" Bullets began to whiz through the dust. Colton grabbed Elodie's hand. "We can't go out the front," he yelled. "Up the stairs to the balcony." They ran up the stairs as bullets splintered the railing. They burst onto the upper balcony that overlooked the main street. But below them, more of Vane's men were gathering. They were trapped. "Colton," Elodie said, looking at the drop. "There's too many of them." Colton looked at the street, then at the horizon. He smiled a grim, wolfish smile. "I didn't come alone, Elodie." He put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a shrill, piercing whistle. From the darkness of the desert, a sound answered. It started as a low rumble, then grew to a thunderous roar. Hoofbeats, hundreds of them. Riding out of the moonlight came the Apache. They weren't attacking the town. They were surrounding it. They held torches that lit up the night, forming a ring of fire around Dry Creek. At the front rode an Apache war chief, and beside him, a federal marshal. "You made friends with the Apache," Elodie gasped. "The chief remembered your father," Colton said. "Governor Joyce was the only white man who never broke a treaty with them. When they found me in the cave, they healed me, and they sent for the marshal." Below, the fighting stopped. Vane's men looked at the ring of Apache warriors and the U.S. Marshals. They dropped their guns. No paycheck was worth fighting the entire Apache nation. But Cyrus Vane wasn't giving up. He burst out onto the street below, dragging Tobias with him. Vane held the deed in one hand and a gun to Tobias's head in the other. "I have the deed," Vane screamed, looking up at the balcony. "The land is mine. The law says so." The federal marshal rode forward. "The law says a deed obtained by coercion is void. Vane, drop the gun." Vane's eyes were wild. He looked at Colton on the balcony. "Come down here, Rance," Vane challenged. "You want to play hero, face me man to man, unless you want me to blow your girlfriend's stepfather's brains out." Colton stiffened. "Let him do it," Elodie whispered bitterly. "Tobias deserves it." "He does," Colton agreed softly. "But if Vane kills him, he never stands trial. And the world needs to know what they did to your father." Colton holstered his gun. He looked at Elodie. "Stay here." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "You're hurt. You can't draw fast enough." "I don't have to be fast," Colton said, his eyes locking with hers. "I just have to be right." He vaulted over the railing, dropping 10 feet to the dusty street below. He landed hard, stumbling slightly as his wounded leg protested, but he straightened up. The street cleared. It was just Colton Rance and Cyrus Vane. The wind howled through Dry Creek, kicking up dust devils that danced between the 2 men. Cyrus Vane shoved Tobias to the ground. Tobias scrambled away, weeping into the arms of a waiting marshal who handcuffed him instantly. "Just you and me, ghost," Vane sneered. He was sweating, his fancy suit covered in dust. He still clutched the deed in his left hand. Colton stood 10 paces away. He stood differently than he had in the saloon. He didn't stand like a gunfighter. He stood like a tired man who was ready to rest. "It's over, Vane," Colton said calmly. "The marshals are here. The Apache are here. Even if you kill me, you hang. I'd rather hang than let a piece of trash like you beat me," Vane spat. "I bought that girl. I own her." "You never owned her," Colton said. "You just rented her time, and the lease is up." Vane's eyes twitched. Colton watched Vane's shoulder. He knew the tell. Vane was a bully, not a warrior. He would draw out of fear, not skill. "Draw!" Vane screamed. Vane's hand dropped to his holster. Colton didn't move, not immediately. He waited for that split second where Vane's hand touched the grip. Then the ghost of the Gila moved. It wasn't a blur this time. It was fluid efficient, practiced 1,000 times. Bang! 1 shot. Vane fired into the dirt, his trigger finger jerking reflexively. Colton's bullet did not hit Vane in the heart. It hit the deed in Vane's left hand. The paper exploded. The bullet passed through the thick stack of documents and buried itself in Vane's shoulder. Vane screamed, spinning around and dropping to his knees. The tatters of the Joyce estate deed fluttered to the ground like confetti. Colton walked forward, kicking the gun away from Vane's good hand. He stood over the sobbing tycoon. "You don't get the easy way out," Colton said, cold as ice. "You don't get to die in a duel. You get a cell, you get a judge, and you get to watch Elodie Joyce take back everything you stole." The marshals swarmed in. They hauled Vane away, screaming curses. Colton watched them go. The adrenaline finally left his body. His vision blurred. The pain in his shoulder and leg came rushing back like a tidal wave. He swayed. The ground seemed to tilt. "Colton." Elodie was there. She had run from the balcony. She caught him just as he started to fall. He sank to his knees, and she went with him, not caring about her white silk dress, dragging in the blood and dirt. "You idiot!" She was crying, but she was smiling too. "You stubborn, impossible idiot." "Did I—" Colton mumbled, his eyes fluttering shut. "Did I fix it?" "Yes," Elodie whispered, pulling his head against her chest. "You fixed it. You kept your promise." Colton Rance passed out in the arms of the woman he had bought for $3. 3 months later, the governor's mansion in the territorial capital was glowing with light. A grand ball was being held to celebrate the reinstatement of the Joyce family. Elodie stood on the veranda, looking out over the gardens. She wore a dress of deep emerald green, the color of life. She was no longer the frightened girl in the saloon. She was Elodie Joyce, the wealthiest woman in Arizona, the owner of the water rights that would feed the territory for 100 years. Tobias Gentry and Cyrus Vane had been sentenced to hang next week. Justice had been swift. But Elodie felt a hollowness in her chest. She heard boots on the stone terrace behind her. She didn't turn. She knew the sound of those boots. "Marshall said you were looking for me," a deep voice said. Elodie turned. Colton stood there. He looked different. He was clean-shaven, though the scar remained. He wore a suit uncomfortable and stiff instead of his duster. He held a hat in his hands. "You were leaving," Elodie said. It wasn't a question. "I saw your horse packed." Colton nodded. He looked at the mansion, then at her. "You're a lady now, Elodie. A real one. You have senators and bankers lining up to dance with you. And I'm just a gunman who knows how to kill people. There's no place for a wolf in a palace." He put his hat on. "I just wanted to say goodbye. You're safe now. My debt is paid." He turned to walk away. "Colton Rance!" Elodie shouted. He stopped. Elodie marched across the terrace. She reached into the pocket of her gown. "You think this is a transaction?" she demanded. "You think you can just balance the ledger and leave—" "Elodie, I—" She grabbed his hand and slapped something into his palm. Colton looked down. It was $3 silver. He looked up confused. "What is this? I'm buying something," Elodie said, her eyes fierce, her chin high. "What?" Colton asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What could you possibly want to buy from a broken-down ranger?" Elodie stepped closer until she was pressing against him, until she could feel the heat radiating off him just like that first night on the horse. "I'm buying your future," she said. "I'm buying your gun, so you never have to use it again unless you want to. And I'm buying the man who saved my life." She reached up and touched the scar on his face. $3, Colton. Take it or leave it. But if you take it, you're mine. No more running. No more ghosts." Colton stared at the coins, then at her. The hard, flinty look in his eyes finally melted away completely. For the first time, Elodie saw peace there. He closed his hand over the coins. He slipped them into his pocket, right next to his heart. "Sold," he whispered. He didn't kneel this time. He pulled her to him, his grip iron and desperate, and he kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and rain, and a promise kept. Below them, the music of the ball played on, but neither of them heard it. The heiress and the gunfighter had found the only treasure in the West worth dying for. And that is the story of how a $3 bid changed the fate of the Wild West. From the dirt floor of a saloon to the marble halls of Power, Elodie, and Colton proved that true worth isn't found in gold or land, but in loyalty, courage, and love. Tobias and Vane paid the ultimate price for their greed, while the ghost of the Gila finally found a reason to live. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and romance, please destroy that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a good story, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic tales from history and beyond. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.